probably near because I grew up near
Right.
St. Bonaventure.
Yep. Who got hurt
And then
also
Walton.
as last year when they.
Yep. Chris Ford of Villanova trashed his knee. I'll never forget it.
Right.
Yeah. But Walton, I latched on to that UCLA team when he was playing, and so he was a favorite. But when he went to the NBA is when he sort of literally let his hair down, and he became like this hippie figure, like that I don't remember ever seeing. This just like a remnant of the '60s, but you're in the '70s, and then he had Jack Ramsey as a coach. He was just as flamboyant. It was I love those Portland teams, and he was just so different. But yeah, he was prone to injury just because of the way he was built, but just never lost his spirit. He was, he even magnified it as he got older. I think he annoyed people. I would a lot because he would just go off on some weird stuff. And
Right.
I just had to laugh. It's like, well, just turn it down then if you don't want to hear it. But,
right. It was definitely not. It was dedefinitely not about the game in front of him.
Well, it was the game going on in his head, whatever that was. But it was baffling sometimes. But I just laughed with him because he knew he had a point. It just didn't really care if no one else could see it. But yeah, he was. I mean, we say one of a kind all the time, but he was.
Yes.
He was one of the unique people in sports and beyond. But, and yes, and of course, love the gym bands because it suited
his lifestyle.
Yeah.
I find it intriguing. I am a devoted fan of several musicians and bands, and I can't imagine doing what Deadheads do, or people who really love bands, jam bands who follow them everywhere, and have literally seen shows up into the hundreds. It's a crazy phenomenon, but that was part of Bill Walton, and part of our musical generation, really. And the term Deadhead is like it almost has escaped the Grateful Dead aspect of it.
Yeah, it's become like a brand, or like
right.
It stands for whatever you are, a fish head, or there's so many bands like
right.
that now who play for forever. And like the Widespread Panic show I saw once, that was 3.5 hours, and it felt like they only played 6 songs, but it was it was just, oh god, it was grueling. I couldn't wait for it to be over. And that was the last one of those I went to because I'm
right.
like, I'm doing nobody justice here because I'm not appreciating any of this. And
right.
people who twirled for 3 hours didn't seem to be either, but they never stopped.
Well, I don't know if a Grateful Dead album is included or anything else, but Apple Music, for better or for worse, usually these lists are, there's a lot of them around Memorial Day. When you listen to Sirius or whatever, basically every station from the yacht rock one to the rock and roll one to the deep tracks one is rolling out some Memorial Day 500 or Indy 500 connection. And Apple Music, maybe in keeping with that time of the year, has put out the top 100 albums of all time. And maybe not surprisingly, they're just trying to create, attention and such. This list is hardly comprehensive, as you explained to me before we started.
I don't know what it is. I'm not seeing a rationale for what it was based on. So I'm guessing, if you think about it, Apple was the company that basically sort of killed the whole idea of an album, because you listen to the music in pieces now, and songs come out as singles, and the album can almost be like an afterthought. So the idea of someone putting out a concept record and where you have to listen to it start to finish, that's gone by the side because you've got your devices and they shuffle. So there's a little bit of irony there that they are they took it upon themselves to declare the best albums ever. But The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill is number 1. I won't argue with that. It's a really good record. It won a truckload of Grammys. And the more we go down this list, the more I'm like, yeah, that's a good record, but you're putting that up here at the expense of other albums that were truly influential that came out in the 60s and the 70s. And it turns out 54 of the albums on this list were released after 1990. So there's 46 that came from the 80s, the 70s, and the 60s, 3 of the most influential decades in music. So
Yes.
there's that. What stopped me was the number 5 album. I saw Blonde. I thought it was going to be Blonde on Blonde by Dylan, but no, it was Blonde by Frank Ocean, number 5, which is ahead of Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life. It's way ahead of, like, the first Dylan record doesn't show up till number 14. There is no Grateful Dead. There's no REM, not even Murmur. Like, okay, that's when I went, like, you're not even looking at the 80s. There was a Cure record on there. I'm like, no, it wasn't nearly as profound and influential as Murmur. So I don't know what the point was, but as I was saying, what this reminds me of, this is kind of like when sports fans argue about different eras and players in different eras. This is like, I mean, no one's going to be as influential as the Beatles. So they had 2 Beatles records, Abbey Road, which was like 3rd or 4th, which I don't even think is their most influential record. Revolver's got to be it for me, and that ended up at like 23. So, but just so many other records that came out then, because there were so many ideas that hadn't been explored. So these bands swooped them up, put out these records that changed the course of music. I don't think anyone's doing that now anymore. So do we just say, well, I think you have to split it into eras, basically. It's like you can't, you can't. I mean, Frank Ocean's Blonde record, the 5th best record of all time. I don't know. I can't.
Yeah, you just. I mean,
there's often rationalize it.
It's often discussed now as to whether any music that's made right now is going to have the kind of lasting impact that, for instance, I mentioned before, and we talked about it before, my wife and I are rewatching the documentary Immediate Family from 2022 with the famous session musicians, Russ Kunkel, Danny Korchmar, Leland Sklar, Waddy Wachtel. And whether, you get too much of it or not, like all 4 of these guys, when they did the little profile of them and their music and how they grew up, they said, well, I was doing this and I was doing that and I was doing this kind of music and I was a classical guy and I like jazz, whatever. And then came the Beatles, and like all of them, so how can that not be obviously given, they didn't make that many records. You can easily stick them all in the top 100 and deservedly so.
Over 7 years, you look at how they evolved. I Want to Hold Your Hand to the White Album or Let It Be. It's just like absolutely stunning. You pick any other band's 7-year span, nobody changed like they did in those 7 years. But yeah, I mean, whenever I make lists, sometimes I'm like, okay, the Beatles aren't included. That's just not fair, because it would be, they would dominate my list. But it is about music and how music is evolving and what younger people, other generations are listening to and what matters to them. And I think a lot of them are in tune to the older music. If you look at analytics from like Spotify, a lot of the most streamed songs and bands are from the 60s and 70s and 80s from younger people. So they're recognizing it. But I think, so this list, I don't know, it needed to come with footnotes or something, a big asterisk.
I think sometimes they're pandering to an audience they don't even understand necessarily. I mean, I imagine that there are a couple of Taylor Swift albums on that list. I would imagine for.
I think there's only one, like 1989.
Well, there you go. Yeah. That's. I guess that's.
Yeah, there's no REM, but there is an Oasis record. Which, I mean, how did they influence music slightly? They were popular. I like their songs, but they just redid, a lot of Beatles licks and formulas and all that.
Yeah, even like Jeff Lynne, for instance, and ELO, who I like. I don't love him. I kind of like him. That's this pure Beatles rehash, totally. I mean, and I think he even would admit it. So. Anyway. No,
I love ELO, but yeah, it's a derivative.
Yeah, it's very derivative. But anyway, that's what we like to do. That's a nice get off your lawn moment, and I like that. So, and we've got some great documentaries to talk about in the future that we haven't seen. One on Stax Records. That's cool. So, always good stuff to talk about, Tim. Always great to take a bit of your time. I appreciate it, and we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good. Thanks, Danny.
We hope you enjoyed the latest Danny Klingscale Reasonably Irreverent podcast. Come back soon for something fresh and new. This podcast was made possible by our great sponsors like Advanced Sports and Family Chiropractic and Acupuncture with 8 convenient locations in the Kansas City metro. Dr. Brad Woodall and his friendly team will improve your health and outlook with every visit. Find out more at asfca.com/Danny.